the pilot asked her what she was going to wear. And she said, well, I'll just wear a dress uniform, a dress Army uniform. And he said, well, why don't you take my parachute? I won't use it. You can't use them again.
Idaho Takes Flight is a new aviation exhibit at the Museum of Idaho, and among the many exhibits on display is a wedding dress made from a parachute. It dates back to World War II and was owned by a local woman named Velma Byrne. She and her husband Clancy met during World War II in North Africa. She was his nurse while he was recovering from an injury, and they started to fall in love, and they dated and eventually were married during wartime. It's a very unique love story, and their son, Mike Byrne, is here to tell us all about it. Mike, thanks for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here. My dad was in the, Clancy Byrne was in the National Guard unit from Rexburg, Idaho. He had joined in the 40s, right before 1940, a year or so before, almost a year and a half before the war started. But they nationalized the Rexburg National Guard and put it into the Army in April of 41. And they were in, actually, they didn't know it at the time. My mother was a nurse from Massachusetts, and she was in graduate school, and they were advertising they needed nurses. They were saying the boys were dying for lack of medical care. So she signed up, she volunteered, and they were in the same convoy that left the United States. They didn't know it, they were in different ships, but they were in the same convoy that was one of the early troops that went to North Africa and in the start of the war. And my dad was had a driver in the Jeep. There were 4 guys in a Jeep, and it was blackout conditions. They couldn't use headlights or anything else, and they had to make a move from one part to the other. And as will happen in the desert, a sand dune or something had hit, and they were under fire, and the Jeep crashed. And the 4 guys were hurt and put in the hospital, and Mom was a nurse there. And he spent a few weeks in it. They were pretty badly mangled. And he spent a few weeks there. And then after that stay, he decided he really liked her. And they tell a funny story about how he came and they were having a birthday party for her, but he wanted to see her. And she came out of the birthday party, and he asked her for a date. And they started dating then. And they both got permission to do it from their relative, their respective commanders. So and the dating stopped because the battle started to take off, and they battled up through Italy. And my dad was driving by in a street, actually in the middle of a campaign, and saw a sign that pointed the way to this hospital. And it was the same hospital unit my dad knew that my mother would be at. So they started dating again once they got to Italy.
So what were the circumstances that involved getting Velma this parachute for a wedding dress? Because it sounds like they weren't actually in a plane or falling out of a plane.
Oh no. They dated and they got permission to marry. And Mom was stationed at a Air Force. Back at that time, it was Army Air Force. They hadn't really had a separate deal, but it was the Allied Air Force base in a town called Caserta, Italy. And Caserta is famous for having, it's thought to be the second most spectacular palace in Europe after Versailles in France. And it's a beautiful palace that both the Germans, and then after we kicked the Germans out, the Allied powers used as their headquarters for the Italian campaign and all the Mediterranean campaign. And this Army Air Force base was right there. And they had a hospital, and that's where Mom was stationed. And so Dad was dating her, and in that hospital, because it was for all regular Army, but also the Army Air Force. One of her patients was a fighter pilot in I think a P-51 that had been shot down, and he took his parachute with him to the hospital. And he was talking to mom, and it was quite an exciting event to have the weddings. It was a lull in the fighting, and the hospital all knew about it, and the people there, and were excited about having a wedding in the midst of chaos and war. And the 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 pilot asked her what she was going to wear, and she said, "Well, I'll just wear a dress uniform, a dress army uniform." And he said, "Well, why don't you take my parachute? I won't use it. You know, you can't use them again." And there were some aides that they had at the hospitals that were just Italian that they employed to help them, and one of them was a seamstress. And she thought it was a wonderful idea, and she said, "I'll make the dress for you." And so instead of having to be married in an army uniform, uh, she was able to have a really, nice wedding dress. You look at it now at the museum, and it's a little bit faded, but not too bad. But for in the middle of a war, it was pretty fancy dress.
So
And there's
what?
that happened a few other times during the war. It's not a unique thing, but it's a very rare thing. There's only a few of them that exist.
What was the date they were finally married, and
They
where
were
were they married?
they were married on my dad's 30th birthday in the chapel in the Air Force Base hospital in Caserta. There was a nice chapel, and they were married there, and they were then able to, and it's kind of a funny story, but they were able to, because there was a lull in fighting, they got leave to take a few days and have a honeymoon. And they went to a place on what's called the Amalfi Coast in Italy, and they went to Sorrento, and they were able to stay at this massively beautiful luxury hotel that's now considered to be one of the finest hotels in Europe, right on the Amalfi Coast in Sorrento. And like my mother said, there would have been no way that they could have afforded something like that, except in the middle of a war. And they were almost alone in this beautiful resort, and they gave them the big suite, and let them have that suite. So they had a really quite nice, for the middle of a war. They had a quite nice honeymoon.
And then they end up coming home after the war and settling down in Idaho Falls.
They settled down at first in Rexburg. My dad was a journeyman lineman for what was then the Utah Power and Light Company, and they went to Rexburg. And then in the early 50s, we moved to Arco, where my dad was made the representative for the Utah Power in Arco, and then he was made the division manager in Rigby in about 1957. So after 1957, Rigby had been our home.
When did your parents pass away?
My mother passed away in 2005, and my dad, she lived to a ripe old age of 88, and the funny thing was, for the previous few years, until my mother had her cancer, we thought my dad had a little weaker health, but he lived to be just before his 104th birthday. So he passed away in 2018.
Most brides, when they get a wedding dress, they don't ever wear it again. But because your mom's dress was so unique, did she ever have occasion to get it out and put it on again?
No, but she kept it very carefully. And at events like when we celebrated a birthday or something like that, we had all the family together. She'd get it out and show, uh, the people that were there. No, but very rarely. And then for my dad's 100th birthday, we actually put it up, and we had a big party, and let everybody see it, and we showed it then, and at their funerals. We would have it out. So it did see the light of day, but not very often. It was pretty rare. And my dad and I really enjoyed going to the Museum of Idaho. It is such a wonderful place. And we would go oftentimes in the summer to spend, an afternoon there, go for a couple of hours. And there was always, they rotated exhibits enough. And yet the older exhibits are always fun to go look at again, too. So he really loved it. And so after he passed, we thought it has some historical significance like that. There's not a lot of them. And we thought the museum would take better care of it than we could. You have professionals there, and they know what they're doing. And it's such a great museum, and that's why all my siblings, we all decided, let's let the people that know how to take care of that take care of it.
Wow. So what a fitting final resting place for that dress then. Where
I think my mother would have been just ecstatic about it. She would have really thought that it was neat.
What a great story. This is such a it's cool that that dress that they were married in is still here, and that people can go and see it.
Yeah, and it's going to be nice because they take really good care of those things that they have in that exhibit. Yeah, when they come down, they get the best of care. They have really good curators there. So I think it's a nice thing that not just for this exhibit, but it'll be used in generations to come. So it really is kind of a neat feeling.